Okay, so these are toss-ups and bonuses taken from my stash of NAQT questions. That is from both the small school national championship and high school national championship. So there are 52 questions. I'm going to try it in one video take and try to get through it as quickly as possible. So, number one, toss-up. Using this city as its model, Homer Hoyt built on the concentric ring model of Robert Park and Ernest Burgess to explain urban development. Burgess was among the founders of a school of urban sociology named for it. His followers worked at a namesake university near Hyde Park in Lake Michigan. A school of monetarist economists are also named for 10 points, what most populous city of Illinois? That is Chicago. To a bonus. He co-wrote A Monetary History of the United States with his wife, Anna Schwartz. For 10 points each, name this University of Chicago economist whose essays were collected in Capitalism and Freedom. And that is, of course, Milton Friedman. That history concluded with a famous quote that this phenomenon is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And that is inflation. Work on the consumption function led Friedman to this hypothesis that consumer choices are driven by long-term financial expectations. And that is the permanent income hypothesis. Number three, it is a toss-up. It got its name from 1974 meeting between Grace Marie Arnett, Dick Cheney, and the future author of The Way the World Works, and a professor at the University of Southern California. Jude Wanniski soon popularized it, and Jack Kemp to support it. It posits that past a certain point, tax revenues will go down, even as tax rates go up. For 10 points, name this eponymous napkin-drawn curve of supply-side economics. And that is, of course, the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve. There we are. For a bonus. Their name is derived from the Greek for rule of nature. For 10 points each, name this 18th century economic school that is regarded agriculture as the sole source of wealth. That is the Physiocrats. This court physician of Louis XV is regarded as the founder of the Physiocratic school, and that is Francois Quesnay. Quesnay broke with this earlier economic theory that emphasized nations' bullion supplies and balance trade as the source of wealth. And that is mercantilism. 5, a toss-up. This economist wrote Essays in Persuasion and a treatise on probability, and he explained equity markets as a beauty contest. He asserted that Lenin believed capitalist economies would fall if the currency were debased in the economic consequences of the peace. For 10 points, name this advocate of government spending and economic stimulus, the British author of The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And that is John Maynard Keynes. Number 6, which is a toss-up. This man popularized the term moral hazard in his essays on the theory of risk-bearing, and proved the first and second welfare theorems with Gerard de Broglie. His thesis, Social Choice and Individual Values, sets forth a theorem that assumes non-dictatorship and independence of irrelevant alternatives to give a result on voting systems. For 10 points, I identify this economist, the namesake of an impossibility theorem. And that is Kenneth Arrow. Arrow has to deal with voting all the time. It comes up in Quiz Bowl. Number 7, a bonus. For 10 points each, which social scientist described religion as the heart of a headless world and the soul of soulless conditions in the introduction of his 1843 critique of Hegel's philosophy of right? That is Karl Marx. Part B, a catalyst to economic activity in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. That, of course, is Max Weber. You hear Protestant ethic, it is going to be Max Weber, and an expression of communal energy or collective effervescence in the elementary forms of religious life. And that is Emil Durkheim. Emil Durkheim. Number 8, a bonus for 10 points each. Name these types of goods from economics. This type of good for which demand increases when its price goes up generally consists of luxuries. It takes its name from the author of the theory of the leisure class. That is a Veblen good. These goods are typically consumed together. The price of one, therefore, affects the consumption of the other. For example, hot dogs and hot dog buns. They are complementary goods, or complements. This term collectively denotes the rest of an agent's purchases except one specific good under study. And that is a composite good. Number 9, a toss-up. This member of the Lausanne School developed the tastes and obstacles concept. An earlier 1906 work had introduced the modern representation of the Edgeworth box. He explored the circulation of elites, and his principle is sometimes known as the 80-20 rule. A situation in which nobody can be made better off without making someone worse off is efficient, according to a, for 10 points, what Italian economist? That is Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto. Toss-up. 10. A discussion of sabotage opens this man's, the engineers, and the price system. This author of The Barbarian Status of Women suggests a dichotomy between ceremonial and instrumental practices in the theory of the business enterprise. This man labeled spending on goods solely as display of wealth as conspicuous consumption. For 10 point, name this economist, author of the theory of the leisure class. And that is Thorstein Veblen. Number 13, a bonus. It delineates two types of state according to the way in which administrative staffs function. For 10 points each, name this 1918 lecture that advances custom, gift of grace, and statutes as the grounds of legitimate rule. And that is Politics as a Vocation. Politics as a Vocation was penned a decade after this earlier work by the same author that argues that the Calvinist mindset contributed to success in the development of the tidal economic system. That is the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The Protestant ethic and politics as a vocation were written by this German sociologist. And that is Max Weber, the Protestant ethic. Spirit of capitalism. Number 14, a toss-up. This man drew a distinction between value in use and exchangeable value in his best-known work. Heckscher and Olin revised one of this man's theories, which states that two countries should each produce what they can make most efficiently instead of producing multiple types of goods. For 10 points, name this economist who wrote Principles of Political Economy and Taxation and described comparative advantage. That is David Ricardo. 15, a toss-up. One of this thinker's works criticizes William Godwin. Another gives rent as an example of a surplus. This author of The Nature of Rent attacks Say's law and Principles of Political Economy. This proponent of the Corn Laws argued that food supply grows arithmetically while population grows geometrically, inevitably causing famine and war. For 10 points, name this British economist who wrote an essay on population. That is Thomas Malthus. The ISLM model, this is a toss-up 16, shows that when this quantity and GDP are in equilibrium, Austrian school economists view this quantity as individuals' time preferences, while the neoclassical model sees it as determined by the supply and demand of capital. This quantity is zero in a liquidity trap, making attempts by the central bank to lower this quantity unsuccessful. For 10 points, name this quantity the rate paid for borrowing money. And that is the interest rate. 17, a bonus. Mirabeau called this economist's tableau économique as important as the inventions of money and writing. For 10 points each, name this French economist who applied the idea of circulation of blood in animals to circulation of value in an economy. That is Francois Quesnay. Part B, Quesnay was a member of this economic school, which claimed all value ultimately came from agriculture or land. There's the physiocrats. This economist, Part C, disagreed with Quesnay's assertion that non-agricultural labor was sterile in the wealth of nations. That is Adam Smith. Toss-up 12, which is a bonus. For 10 points each, name these influences, economic and otherwise, on Paul Krugman. Krugman has cited this author's foundation novels as his inspiration for becoming an economist. This man also wrote I, Robot, as well as hundreds of non-fiction works. That is Isaac Asimov. Part B, Krugman named one of his cats after this author of the science fiction Canopus in Argos series and The Golden Notebook. And that is Doris Lessing. Krugman's work in international trade has focused more on returns to scale and less on this concept formulated by David Ricardo, which states parties can benefit from trade if they have different relative costs of producing goods. And that, of course, comparative advantage. 13, a toss-up. This quantity appears as the denominator of the Lerner index, and the Penn effect states this type of quantity will be higher in high-income countries than in low-income countries, which goes against the notion of purchasing power parity. For a given market basket, the consumer index of these quantities may be tracked over time. For 10 points, name this economic concept the cost of a good. And that is the price. 14, a bonus. For 10 points each, give these terms from economics. This is a good whose consumption by another prevents simultaneously consumption by other consumers, such as food or compact discs. Those are rivalrous goods. This is a rivalrous good which is not excludable, such as forests or coal, but which may be renewable. They are a common good. This problem occurs when multiple consumers deplete a common good, even though this is not in anyone's long-term interest. This term was coined by ecologist Garrett Hardin, who used the example of overgrazing of pastures. And that is the tragedy of the commons. Number 15, a toss-up. The exponents of a Cobb-Douglas production function equal the output variety of this kind of dimensionless quantity. Analytically, one is the derivative of y with respect to x times x over y, so that a vertical line represents a perfect manifestation. Complementary goods have a negative cross-price version of, for 10 points, what ratio of percentage changes in two economic variables? That is elasticity. 16. This work states the more state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. For 10 points each, name this work, which claimed that in collectivist ethics, the end justifies the means, becomes the supreme rule. That is The Road to Serfdom. This economist wrote The Road to Serfdom. That is Frederick Hayek. Friedrich Hayek was heavily critical of this British economist who wrote the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And that is, of course, John Maynard Keynes. 17, a toss-up. The graph of this quantity as a function of goods or wealth is concave down if the individual in question is risk-averse or if a greater quantity is associated with diminishing marginal amounts of this. Indifference curves connect points at which this is equal, and rational people supposedly try to maximize it. For 10 points, give this economic term for the measure of satisfaction or usefulness. And that is utility. 18, a toss-up. In a book on the first 5,000 years of this quantity, David Graeber called for an international jubilee. Irving Fisher's theory of the Great Depression is named for deflation in this economic quantity. A spreadsheet error afflicted a 2010 study by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, arguing that a high ratio of this quantity to GDP destroys growth. Budget deficits increase for 10 points. What quantity owed to a creditor? That is debt. Number 19, a bonus. Author William Shepard listed 22 examples of these, including high product differentiation, asset specificity, sunk costs, and patents. For 10 points each, name this economics term for obstacles that block new potential competitors in a market. And that would be barriers to entry. Part B, this barrier to entry is a tax on imports deterring foreign participants from domestic markets. And that is a tariff. This term refers to a market with a small number of sellers, which is comparable to a market with high barriers to entry. And that is an oligopoly. Unlike a monopoly, it has few. Toss-up 20. It's a toss-up. This thinker wrote about the conflicting views of society called taxis or nomos in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, which built off an earlier work asserting that liberty precedes economic growth, the Constitution of Liberty. While in London, he wrote a work claiming that a central planning destroys individual freedom. For 10 points, name this Austrian economist known for his The Road to Serfdom. And that is Friedrich Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek. 21, a toss-up. In extended treatments of these constructs, they surround satiation points. Income expansion paths consist of the tangency points of budget lines with these constructs, which are L-shaped for perfect complements. The marginal rate of substitution equals the slope of one of these curves at a given point. For 10 points, name these economic curves displaying sets of goods that provide a consumer at a given level of utility. That is an indifference curve. 22, a toss-up. A 3-volume biography of this man and a smaller work about him, subtitled The Return of the Master, were written by Roger Skidelsky. In an article on this man and the classics, John Hicks introduced the ISLM model. He attacked Say's law and argued that the economy in full employment is one of many possible equilibria. For 10 points, name this author of the general theory of employment, interest, and money. That is John Maynard Keynes. 23, a toss-up. These economic goods display parallel indifference curves and linear utility function. In monopolistic competition, goods are usually dose, but not perfect examples of this type of good, which will display a positive cross-price elasticity. Margarine and butter are examples of, for 10 points, what type of goods that can easily replace others and are contrasted with complementary goods. They are substitute goods. Remember, the complementary goods would be like hot dogs and hot dog buns. This economic concept was introduced, toss-up 24, in a discussion of the glazier's paradox, or the parable of the broken window, in an 1850 essay, What is Seen and What is Unseen, by Frederick Bastiat. It manifests as a vertical fall along a production possibility frontier when moving to the right, and it equals the value of the second best choice of action. For 10 points, name this economic cost of foregone alternatives. That is the opportunity cost. 25, bonus. In the economic consequences of the peace, this man called the Treaty of Versailles a Carthaginian peace. For 10 points each, name this British economist who wrote the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And that is John Maynard Keynes. Keynes' general theory labels the emotions affecting consumer confidence as these forces. George Akerlof and Robert Schiller titled their book on the 2007 economic crisis with this phrase. And that would be animal spirits. One of Keynes's fiercest critics was this Austrian economist who authored The Road to Serfdom. And that is Friedrich Hayek. The Road to Serfdom. 26. The title of a 2013 Jacob Kornbluth documentary starring Robert Reich promises this concept for all. In April 2014, Pope Francis tweeted that it is the root of social evil. The Gini coefficient measures this phenomenon, which increases when the rate of return of capital exceeds the rate of economic growth, according to a book by Thomas Piketty. For 10 points, name the situation in which the wealth is not evenly distributed. That is inequality. 27, a toss-up. Irving Fisher wrote a 1973 paper claiming credit for discovering this concept. The argument that this graph takes a different shape in the long run was advanced by Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps. The Nauru hypothesis builds off that work to argue that in the long term, this curve resembles a vertical line. For 10 points, what economic curve shows an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation? And of course, that's the Phillips curve. 28, a toss-up. Gerard Debreu extended this economist's work on proving that all Walrasian equilibria are Pareto efficient. This man proved the first welfare theorem and is also the namesake of a theorem that certain criteria, including monotonicity and non-dictatorship, are violated when individual ranked preferences are converted to community preferences. For 10 points, what economist formulated a voting impossibility theorem? And that is Arrow's voting impossibility theorem. Arrow in voting. 29, businesses can own tangible and intangible forms of these economic resources. For 10 points, these give this term meaning anything with an economic value that can benefit a company's future operations. Assets. This type of financial statement, also known as a statement of financial position, is named for the fact that a company's assets must equal its liabilities plus equity. And that is a balance sheet. This intangible asset on a balance sheet occurs when one company buys another's net assets for a value greater than the fair market value. It often arises from a positive reputation, and it shares its name with a charitable organization. That is goodwill. Toss-up 30. This man studied the difference between financing a war with bonds and taxes, concluding that there was no financial difference. Robert Barrow modernized that theory, called this man's equivalence. This man cited Portuguese wine and English cloth in his argument that opportunity cost determines when countries should exchange goods. For 10 points, what economist put forth a theory of comparative advantage? And that is David Ricardo. 31, a bonus. A simple version of this model examines two countries producing two commodities with two factors of production, so it is called by the 2x2x2 model. For 10 points, identify this model of trade named for two Swedish economists. And that is the Heckscher-Ohlin, or HO model. The Heckscher-Ohlin model built on this 19th century concept that justifies trade based on lower opportunity costs of producing goods in different countries. And that is comparative advantage. This economist stated a theory of comparative advantage on the principles of political economy and taxation. And that, of course, is David Ricardo. 32, a toss-up. This thinker wrote that learning can only take place during activity and is economic consequences of learning by doing. His research to innovation to build upon endogenous growth theory and, with Gerard Debreu, proved that accuracy of a general equilibrium model. For 10 points, named this American economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1972 for formulating a voter preference paradox called his impossibility theorem. And that is Kenneth Arrow. You are seeing the canon in action, Arrow's theorem of voting. Toss-up, or 33, a bonus. This thinker described the stock market as a game of snap of old maid of musical chairs for 10 points each. Name this British economist who wrote a general theory of employment, interest, and money. That is John Maynard Keynes. Part B, Keynes coined this term to mean how spontaneous human emotions can determine consumer confidence and investment. It titles a 2009 book on the Great Recession by George Akerlof and Robert Schiller. That is Animal Spirits. That has now come up twice. Keynes disparaged classical economics and encouraged aggressive monetary policy by declaring that we are all dead in this reference frame. This frame is commonly used to denote far future in economics. That is the long run. The long run, we are all dead. 34, bonus. This man's namesake rule limited proprietary trading as a part of the Dodd-Frank Act. For 10 points each, Part A, name this economist who raised interest rates as the Fed Reserve Chairman in the 1980s. That is Paul Volcker. Part B, by raising interest rates, Volcker curtailed this economic phenomenon that had plagued the U.S. economy in the 1970s. Gerald Ford called for Americans to whip this phenomenon now. And that, of course, is inflation. The Whip Inflation Now campaign was characterized as unbelievably stupid by this man, Volcker's successor. As Federal Reserve Chairman from 1987 to 2006, he presided over a period of easy money policies. That is Alan Greenspan. So just very quickly, you need to know Paul Volcker in the 1980s, then Alan Greenspan for 2 decades or more, and then a few others afterwards, which include the current guy, Jerome Powell, and before him, of course, Janet Yellen. Number 35, a bonus. According to Robert Gordon's 2016 book on the rise and fall of this rate, technological innovations won't be enough to maintain it at 20th century levels. For 10 points each, name this economic rate, and that is the rate of growth. Rate of growth. Part B. The Solow model describes growth in terms of increased labor supply, increases in productivity, and accumulation of this factor of production. It is symbolized K and is contrasted with labor, and that is, of course, capital. And Part C, in his 2013 book, Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty argued that the rate of return on capital was naturally greater than economic growth, resulting in long-term increase of this phenomenon. And that is inequality. Piketty, inequality. 36, a toss-up. In a book chapter titled Alleviation of Poverty, this economist advocated a negative income tax. Like Edmund Phelps, this economist pioneered the idea that there is a natural rate of unemployment. This man used the image of dropping money out of a helicopter to advocate an expansionary monetary policy. For 10 points, name this Chicago-based economist who advocated for free markets and capitalism and freedom. That is, of course, Milton Friedman. Toss-up 37. A type of this factor is measured by using name generators to construct social networks. According to Pierre Bourdieu, standards of taste are determined by those possessing the cultural type of this factor. The book Bowling Alone traces the decline in the social form of this factor. The third factor of production after land and labor is, for 10 points, what measure of the initial assets that fund economic ventures? And, of course, that is capital. 38, bonus. For 10 points each, answer the following about Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. For the first 20 years of his life, Hayek's last name was preceded by this three-letter particle denoting nobility. Austria removed this word from all surnames in 1919. That is von Hayek. In his 1943 book, Hayek claimed that central economic planning was a threat to liberty, a belief that influenced Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And of course, that is The Road to Serfdom. Hayek was a second cousin to this Austrian philosopher. This man expressed his philosophy of language in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And that is, of course, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And I will give you my anecdote about him in person, if whoever watching this will remind me. Number 39. Toss-up. This institution's longest-serving chairman joked that his job was to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. In 2007, this institution introduced the term auction facility because of a refusal to borrow short-term funds from its discount window. This agency employed quantitative easing to lower interest rates during the 2008 financial crisis. For 10 points, name the central bank of the U.S., and that is the Fed, or the Federal Reserve. 40, a toss-up. This phenomenon is measured by an index named after British economist Tony Atkinson. Free market capitalism inevitably results in this phenomenon because the rate of return of capital exceeds the rate of return of economic growth, according to Thomas Piketty. The Gini coefficient measures, for 10 points, what economic phenomenon defined as the gap between levels of wealth among people of society. And that would be, of course, inequality. Inequality. 41, a bonus. For 10 points each, answer the following about the 1936 work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The general theory was written by this British economist who criticized the Treaty of Versailles and the economic consequences of the peace. And that is John Maynard Keynes. In General Theory, Keynes argued that unemployment could be reduced by using this kind of spending to increase aggregate demand. This kind of spending is one of the main tools of fiscal policy. That is governmental spending, or government spending. In the General Theory was published in the aftermath of this worldwide economic downturn, sparked by a stock market crash in 1925. That is the Great Depression. 42, a bonus. This graph's namesake supposedly sketched it on a napkin to make a point to Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. For 10 points each, what curve predicts that the setting of the tax rate at either 0% or 100% will yield no government revenue? That is the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve illustrates this theory of economics that advocates for deregulation to create growth. This term is often used synonymously with trickle-down economics. That is supply side. Early supply side economists invoked this law, named for a Frenchman, which states that supply creates its own demand. That is Say's law. Number 43, a bonus. Franklin Fisher defined this type of cost as a cost that prevents socially beneficial behavior. For 10 points each, name this type of cost that a firm must incur to go into a market, which is not required of firms already in the market. That is a barrier to entry. Part B, high barriers to entry may lead to this phenomenon in which there is only one seller in a given market. That is a monopoly. A common barrier to entry is that new firms must often acquire this kind of property, such as a patent or trademark, to compete in the new market. That is intellectual property. Number 44, I think there are only 52. Economist Keith Chin trained monkeys to use money to see if they obeyed the same economic laws as humans for 10 points each. Chin found the monkeys obeyed this economic law, which holds that if the price of a good falls, people will buy more of it. It is named for a quantity contrasted with supply. And that is the law of demand. The monkeys also displayed this effect from behavioral economics, whereby owning a thing makes you value it more. And that is the endowment effect. The endowment effect. The money-using monkeys were discussed in the 2007 sequel to this book by Stephen Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner, which adds super to this book's title. And that is Freakonomics. Freakonomics. 45, a bonus. For 10 points each, answer the following about economic growth models. Growth is often stated in terms of this measure of an economy's performance, the sum of all value-added output within a country in a given period of time. And that is the GDP or GNP, gross domestic or gross national product. Part B, W. Swan model predicts that short-term growth occurs through the accumulation of this factor of production, denoted K. And that is, of course, capital. Part C, this adjective describes growth models developed in the 1980s and 1990s that explain growth as a result of variables contained within the model as opposed to external forces. And that would be endogenous forces. 46, a bonus. For 10 points each, answer the following about the fundamental theorems of welfare economics. The first fundamental theorem formalizes the concept of the invisible hand that this Scottish economist wrote about in The Wealth of Nations. That is Adam Smith. The first and second fundamental theorems discuss the optimality named for this Italian economist in which nobody can be better off without making someone else worse off. And that is Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto. The first fundamental theorem fails in these models developed by Maurice Allais and Paul Samuelson, in which new groups of individuals arrive over time and experience young and old periods of life. That is overlapping generation models. 47, a toss-up. This author of The High Price of Bullion posited that the choice between tax financing and debt financing doesn't affect consumer spending in his namesake equivalents. A book by this man presents the law of rent and describes the theory of trade exemplified by English cloth and Portuguese wine. For 10 points, name this economist whose book on the principles of political economy and taxation proposed comparative advantage. And that is David Ricardo. Number 48. Alan Greenspan deemed this initiative unbelievably stupid when it was first proposed. For 10 points each, name this White House initiative to combat the 1970s economic crisis. Its proponents wore red buttons with this initiative's three-letter acronym. WIN, or Whip Inflation Now. Whip Inflation Now was one of many political missteps by this Republican president who was not elected to either the office of vice president or president, and that is Gerald Ford. The economic crisis prompted Ford to deny this city's plea for federal bailout in 1975, prompting a newspaper here to run the ironic headline, Ford to City, Drop Dead. And that was New York City, having trouble in the 1970s. 49. Bonus. This man used the term countervailing power to describe civic institutions that could combat the influence of corporations. For 10 points each, name this economist who argued that competition in the U.S. economy had been thwarted by the political influence of business interests in his 1952 book, American Capitalism. That is John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith popularized the phrase conventional wisdom in this 1958 book that argued for an increased public sector spending. That is The Affluent Society. Galbraith's book, The Great Crash, is subtitled for this year in which the Great Depression began. That is 1929. Toss-up, or 50, a bonus. For 10 points each, answer the following about sociologist Richard Sennett. Sennett wrote multiple books about the new form of this economic system, including corrosion of character. In this system, most enterprises are run for profit. And that, of course, is capitalism. Sennett's 2018 book, Building and Dwelling, frequently references this American urbanist's book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. That is Jane Jacobs. Building and Dwelling is a part of Sennett's series of books titled for this two-word Latin phrase meaning man the maker. Hannah Arendt contrasted it with animal laborans. And this is Homo faber, or faber. 51. Toss-up. This man tried to predict living conditions 100 years in the future in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He quipped that Lenin was right, that debauching currency could break capitalism. This key participant in the Bretton Woods Conference proposed unemployment resulted from low aggregate demand in the 1936 book. For 10 points, what economist wrote General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money? That is John Maynard Keynes. 52, the last, which is a bonus. John Stuart Mill classified lighthouses as this type of good. For 10 points each, name this type of good that everyone can consume simultaneously and from which no one is excluded, such as fair. And that would be a public good. Because maintaining public good requires resources, this economics problem occurs when those who benefit from a public good do not pay for it. And that is the free rider problem. An overconsumption of public goods often gives rise to this type of harm that affects people who did not choose to incur that harm. And that is a negative externality, And remember, the tragedy of the commons is a part of the problem of the free rider problem. So it's 30 minutes, 50 questions, but you will start to see the things repeat. Hopefully, by the time you've gotten through all of this for economics, you're a solid economics quiz bowl player at the high school level. Keep studying, keep learning. Thanks.